And let me share. Let me see. Let me bring up my screen. See if I can share that with you guys. Okay. So are you guys able to see my screen now? These plants and animals PowerPoint. Okay, cool. So, yeah. So I think like kind of the big topic of this stuff that we've been covering this last few weeks, like we've been talking about like the sensitive and the nutritive souls, and really what that's getting at is the difference between plants and animals. And so this is from Plants versus Zombies, but there are some animals in this picture too. We got some bison and a mammoth and the zombies riding on them. But yeah, essentially, let me see, is it going to share? Let me share. There we go. So some of the key concepts that we should have from now, like we started kind of at the beginning. Aristotle is a little different from Plato. Plato talks about the soul sort of as like this pilot or this driver that leaves the body at death, and it's like sort of this separate. Because remember, Plato's all about forms, and that nature's trying to reach these ideal forms, but it can't quite make it. Aristotle differs from Plato in saying that the soul is sort of like this actuality or this essence of living beings or these natural bodies. And so he argues that you need to have these two things together, that the soul and the body have to coexist in order for you to have a living being. Does anyone remember what exactly is a natural body, though, according to Aristotle? What's it mean to be a natural body? Right, it does need to have a soul and it does need to have a body. But I think one of the distinctions he's going to make later on is like we could talk about things that get affected, like, I can have rocks or air or water that's affected by different actors and stuff. But what makes a body like a living body? What's the difference between like rocks and water and air and living things? What's unique about living things? Because they also have forms in a way. Like you can say like a rock's got this shape and it's got this quality and stuff to it. But what makes a living thing different from or a natural body different from like um a non-living thing? Because he uses like this. See if this jogs your memory, but he describes like that he describes like organs and describes like the different functions and stuff of the leaves of different plants and stuff. I don't know if that rings a bell or not. Mm-hmm. Make sure. Can I pop this up here? Gotcha. Okay. So what he was just trying to state is that what makes a natural body different from all these other bodies, like we can see stuff that seems to be, it's like hard sometimes to see the difference between like plants and like things that may not necessarily live in. Like we can see like slime molds and stuff that seem to grow, but they don't really have um, the same feature stuff that other animals and plants do. But essentially, he says that a natural body is a body that's organized. And when we think of organized, I think what we usually tend to think of is like, I can describe my desk. Like my desk has like well, my desk is not very organized, but maybe like my mom or my brother's desk is. But you can see like everything's kind of compartmentalized. When they're describing organized, it means that there are certain parts of it that have like different tools, like roots. Their job is to get food for the plant. He describes like these leaves, they're supposed to protect the fruit or the different parts. So he's just saying that natural bias seems to be broken down to like these different parts that have different tools. And I think that part of thinking of it as like tools will help when we look at some of these ways that the soul can be a cause for living things. So he says that the soul we can treat as one of the causes of living things. And so in the reading, he describes it, it's the source, the origin of movement. He said anything that moves on its own has to have like a soul. So that was like one of the big things they talked about when he's like taking together bits of information from the pre-Socratics is that things that have souls in them seem to be able to move. They have their own source of movement within them. He also talks about the essence, the souls like describes like the form, like what is it that the organism is supposed to look like? What is it supposed to be able to do? So the soul is a way like we could think of it as like the DNA or the shape. Like what is it supposed to look like? What's its job? Or like is it not necessarily its job, but what is it supposed to look like? And then I think the final cause is kind of an interesting one to look at. When I saw like the readings that, or the submissions that everyone was placing for the readings, most of us were including things like happiness or getting heaven. And those are in a way causes, and perhaps we like are looking at from a theological point, like those could be causes for the living things. But I think what Aristotle is trying to get at here is that if we look at the way that all the different parts of an organism serve some sort of function, like we talked about the plants, like plants have roots and leaves that help it do different jobs. The soul is what the like being able to sustain life and be able to do like all the different things that plants do. That's what determines like the why we have all these different parts of a living organism. So you can kind of tie this in with like different biology ideas and stuff. It's that um, in order for something to be passed on or inherited to successive generations, it has to serve some sort of purpose. Like our appendixes, like that's an example of something that keeps getting passed on. It seems we call it a vestigial organ now because it doesn't seem to serve us anything. We also have like tailbones that don't seem to serve any purpose. But at some point in our history, they did. Like, our ancestors, like way back, may have had tails, or our appendix when we had tails, like yes, they did serve some sort of purpose. And so we can see like, all these different things that like make up an organism, they do serve some sort of function. Like, our hands help us to acquire food, our um, hair helps keep us warm. Like all these things like serve different functions in that it's like contributing towards the life of the organism. So that's one way we could think of is like when we talk about all these different organs and stuff, they all serve a purpose. And that's what we could think of when we talk about the final cause. The soul like is the final cause of the natural organism. We could talk about like so I think if we like some folks who were bringing up like well isn't like happiness or good stuff like the final cause perhaps of the soul. That is I think into theological part. If we're looking at just like the soul itself, like what is the purpose of the soul? Like yes, then I think we could talk about happiness, those other things. But I think we're just focusing on living beings, like natural bodies, like what makes a natural body able to do the things it does. So for living things, like this is like the soul acts as like the final cause. Um, I want to just double check. I can't see if there's anyone else who's trying to join. Let me see if I can. Nope, that's not what I want to do. I want to just take a quick pause and see if there's anyone else trying to join. Let me see if I can. Aha. Let me see. Manage participants. That's nice. It doesn't look like anyone else is trying to join. Okay, we're good. So, and then over here, I want to go back. All right. Let's close this. So I guess the other thing I want to point out, this little diagram I think right here kind of just gives us the quick survey of all the different types of souls. So it's not that, so we have our most basic soul, which is the vegetative soul or the nutritive soul. Its job is to take care of reproduction, growth, self-nutrition. Animals have a sensitive soul, so that means they still also have like a vegetative soul. So like it has like all the powers of the vegetative soul, in that animals can reproduce and they can grow. But some animals can also move, and as we'll talk about later, all animals can somehow sense things, and that's why they're called the sensitive soul. And then humans are over here, they have rational souls. So not only do they have the powers of the sensitive and the vegetative soul, but we also can think about things and reflect. And that's why that's kind of like we can describe like how things are all related to each other. So that's like a quick survey. Now let's dive in and talk about the two souls that we've talked about so far, our nutritive and sensitive soul. Who is Juliana? Let's see who this is. Someone is trying to enter. Give me one sec. Let me see. Who is... Can I see this person? I think we've had someone else try to join us. Can you hear? Who's on iPhone to Juliana? Speak, mysterious guest. Who are you? They are not. They're muted right now. Okay. We'll see if they reveal themselves later. Okay. We'll continue on. So the next thing that I want to talk about. Let me see if I can go back to this now. So, are we talking about let's talk about our nutritive soul. So that's the most basic type of soul, and we assign three jobs or responsibilities or powers to the nutritive soul. And if we talk about self-nutrition, so being able to feed yourself, they're responsible for growth and are responsible for reproduction. This is like the most basic requirements for something to be alive. Is that according to Aristotle, that it has to be able to grow, it has to be able to feed itself, and somehow be able to reproduce and create more of themselves. We talked about how he said for most living things, that's how they can participate in like the divine, is that they can't like necessarily be infinite, but by being able to have successive generations, that's how they take part in this divine life. Which is kind of, I think this is kind of interesting to look at because we can also talk about this who okay, I can see someone else floating around. We can talk about this is sort of interesting for me to look at trying to compare this to the modern list of who is it, Jason? I got other people trying to get in. I'll go ahead and admit this person, see what happens. So I have listed here like so we have the Aristotle's list for the powers of the nutritive soul up top, self-nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Zena, you might recognize some of these things from biology class, but we have a there's like a different description of like their categories for life nowadays. We've kind of added more stuff to the list, or maybe like try to uh add more details I think to this list. And so sort of like the modern list of the different requirements is like it has to have metabolism. Metabolism just means that like you're taking in food, you're processing the food using energy, and you have to like excrete like waste. Homeostasis, that's a fancy word for just maintain like the same state within yourself. So like for mammals, we have to maintain a certain temperature, and we have to have so much oxygen, and we like to be having a certain amount of food and stuff. And so those are all like trying to maintain like that same state within our bodies. I think that kind of fits in with like the self-nutrition part and also like the metabolism feeding itself. Growth, that kind of fits in with like the growth and change part. And then 4 and 5 is like this ability to reproduce, passing on traits to offspring. Number 6 and number 7, I think we can are interesting ones, and I don't see how they necessarily fit in with Aristotle's. We can talk about responsiveness to the environment, and that kind of ties in more with like the sensitive soul. But we can also talk, I think when we were talking about the difference between plants and animals, a lot of people mentioned, well, we can see that somehow plants do respond to their environment. I think Jordy and some other folks you mentioned, like, plants try to grow towards sunlight. They don't, if you place them in a dark room, there's a pinprick of light or something, they're going to try and grow towards it. So that's something interesting we can kind of compare and contrast with Aristotle's most basic definitions for life. Something else that folks have added on later is that it must be made of cells. So that's part of like the cell theories that all living things, that at least that we know of, are made of cells. But still, we can see that a lot of the different ideas that Aristotle introduces covers a lot of the stuff that we talk about in modern biology. So that's some of the stuff that I just want to point out. But that basically, in order for something to be living, it has to at least have the nutritive soul. It has to be capable of self-nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Let's see. The next thing I wanted to talk about, how am I doing on time? Oh, I meant to talk more about food, but food is essentially like, something that the organism is able to take in and assimilate somehow into itself, and it contributes to its growth and its reproduction. And it looks different for different organisms, so it doesn't really give like a huge definition on what food is, but he just kind of describes like, animals and plants both need it, and it helps them grow and reproduce. So the next one then, the next level up is our sensitive soul. And it's responsible, Aristotle says that it's responsible for sensation, desire, and locomotion. And according to Aristotle, he says that there's one of these powers that is responsible for separating plants from animals. So what is that power that separates plants from animals? Yes, according to Aristotle, plants cannot sense things. And so this is what separates plants from animals. Is that Alicia? Lisa, can you hear us and see us okay? Okay, I think I just saw. Oh, okay, okay, cool. Alicia is now on. Okay, great. And I have someone who's just marked as adjacent. Adjacent person, can you hear us? Oh, it's Jason? Okay, great. Okay, very good. So let me see what else I had on this PowerPoint. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. So Aristotle says what makes plants and animals different is sensation. He doesn't say that necessarily that's motion, which would probably a lot of us would think of as like, yeah, we could think of examples of animals running around and stuff. He doesn't necessarily describe it as desire, but we can talk about how desire and sensation are related. But according to Aristotle, the big difference between plants and animals is that animals are able to sense things. So what exactly is sensation? He spends a lot of book two talking about senses. And I think it's some of it's like pretty interesting. And also, I think in the reading for this that was due today, he leaves all the way at the bottom of book 12 this really interesting definition of sensation, which I think will be useful for us to think about and might explain more why he differentiates plants and animals from each other. But most of what he's talking about at the beginning is that a sense or perception is like similar to knowledge. We can say that it alternates between states of potentiality and actuality. So I can, when we talk about knowledge, I can talk about knowledge of grammar. Like I have the potential knowledge of grammar when I am aware of it, but I'm not necessarily using it, or I have the capacity to know it, but I haven't actually learned that knowledge of grammar yet. When I'm actually using grammar, my knowledge of grammar is being actualized is when I'm exercising that knowledge, like I'm writing a sentence or I'm teaching somebody about grammar. It says that that same distinction applies to sensation. So I can put my senses can be exist in a state of potentiality, where right now I'm sitting in a chair, I'm not necessarily smelling anything, but if my mom then pulls bread out of the oven or something like that, then I'm going to be more aware of my sense of smell. We can kind of go back and forth between these states where my senses are being actualized or being potentially used. So they seem to have a little bit more of this. So it's like an interesting thing we can contrast between them and some of the other faculties of souls later. I don't remember if he gives like another definition of sense, but essentially a sense is being aware of like some affection of an object outside of the organism. But I would think it's really interesting here, and I don't know why he leave. Well, I'll give my reason for I think why he leaves it all the way at the end of book two. But he then gives this definition of sense is that a sense is the power of receiving in itself the sensible form of something without the matter itself. And so if you read through like I think starting at book five, he then starts describing like in order for us to have a sense requires some sort of object to trigger them or actualize them. So example I gave is like, my mom brings out like a fresh loaf of bread from the oven. That smell's going to hit my senses, and then I'm actualizing or using that sense of smell. So this like the difference between it and some of the other faculties of thought, like or the soul, like thinking or imagination. Usually, a sense requires some outside object to start it or to actualize it. And so we can talk like I'm not going to be using my power sight or power touch unless like I'm coming into contact with some other object. And so the analogy that he uses is we can describe like sensible or the senses as sort of like these combustible objects. So like I can't nothing spontaneous as far as we can tell spontaneously combust. I can't just have fire just poof into existence by itself. There has to be some kind of agent that starts a fire. I could have like gasoline. That's some things that are very easy to start on fire, but there has to be some source. Like it has to be like some kind of friction, like with a match, or there has to be some spark of like electricity, that starts your car. Things that are combustible, they need to have some sort of agent or object that triggers them. And so he's saying that the same thing happens with the senses. So they needed some sort of outside object to start them. And so he spends a little bit of time talking about special objects of the senses, and a special object of the senses is an object that's only detected by one of the senses. So what is the special object of sight or vision? Was it one thing that only sight can detect? Does anyone know? Yes, color is the one thing that's detectable by vision. And so does anyone know what the sensible object is for, let's see, what's another one? Uh, let's talk about. Uh, Sound. Did anyone has anyone worked through those readings yet? Does anyone remember what are the other special objects for the different senses? Taste. So which one is what's taste? Hmm. Hmm. We could, well, taste is one of the senses, but what is like the special things that taste can pick up? Zena, were you gonna add something? Okay. Right. So sound, well, sound is, yeah, if you could, sound is like what special object of hearing. So yeah, if hearing's our sense, sound is the special object. We can talk about like, there's like, he just starts say like another interesting thing he says is that there's these different contraries that are present in each of the senses as well. So we can talk about things for sight, it's things that are super bright or super dark. So if it's dark, we can't see anything. If it's super bright, you guys, I don't know if you guys are super familiar with like the welding. I guess you probably have seen people weld, but like a common problem. He talks about how like senses can get destroyed if there's something that a particular one of the contraries they're exposed to over and over again is too much. And so the example I thought of is like, if you look at the sun for too long, or if you're welding, like, for welders, they have to wear that special face shield that has like the really protective like glasses stuff. Because if you weld for too long, eventually, since it's super bright, it's going to destroy your eyesight. Welders, like especially in the US, I think that's like one of the jobs that's like the fastest turnover rate because if you're a full-time welder, your eyesight will go bad even if you have like the protective glasses. But I think so I think for hearing, it is sound, and he talks about like we can have like low or high pitched sounds, or I think he describes it as grave or high pitched sounds. For taste, we could talk about like and smell. Taste and smell are really closely related, and he describes we can talk about like sweet or pungent or bitter and some of these other things. And then touch, I think touch is also an interesting one. Touch has a lot of special objects. Does anyone remember what or want to take a guess at one of the special objects are for touch? What's something you can only detect with touch? Yeah, we could talk about hard or soft. So that's something that only touch will be able to tell you. I mean, you might be able to like look at something and say, well, I can guess like if I've touched like carpets long enough, hopefully this carpet's gonna be soft, but you still need to have touch to make sure that it's actually soft. What are some other things that you need a sense of touch in order to detect? Yep, wet or dry is one. What's happening here? Someone trying to. Another one we could. Let me see. Someone. I'm still figuring out Zoom. There's like a message. I was just saying something is coming up here on Zoom. I think someone's trying to send me a message, but I can't find it. Where's the chat option? Ah, yes. Jason sends a comment from the Netherworld. It is heat, hot and cold is another one that is unique to the sense of touch. Okay. So those are some of the things. Like touch is kind of a funny one because there's lots of different special objects that it has. So let me see. Is there anything else? I think one of the other big ideas it talks about is like a lot of the senses, like there has like this balance between these countries where there's like sensitive to certain range. And so if it exceeds that range, it gets outside of that range of comfort, we can just destroy that sense. And so I think we can think of this when we talk about touch pretty easily. I, my mom and dad used to tell me the story that like if we came in from the cold and we washed our hands with really hot water, that eventually it's going to be really bad for our hands, and eventually we lose our sense of touch if we continue to wash our hands. If we like went from like really cold to really hot too fast. And I don't know if you guys have heard other similar stories and something like that. Um, but that is like something we can happen. Like if you touch burning objects and stuff over time, it can destroy the nerves in your hands so that you can't necessarily touch it or feel stuff as much anymore. Or if you build calluses up over time from like handling different stuff, it will numb your sense of touch. Or if you work in a factory where there's a lot of pungent smells and stuff that are bad for you, it can destroy your sense of um, smell. And as I get with the welders, you can also destroy your sense of sight over time if you're repeatedly exposed to really bright lights. And that's why they tell you don't look at the sun. Make sure you wear glasses or something like that. So that's good. I thought it was something interesting about. He talks about like all these senses. There's like a happy medium or set of a balance between like the two different contraries of like what the range of things are they can detect. And it's different for different animals too. We can talk about how like dogs and cats they can tend to hear things of like a higher frequency. That's why we have dog whistles that you can blow in a dog whistle. You and I don't hear anything, but all the dogs in the neighborhood will start barking if you use a dog whistle because it's at a higher frequency than what are that we can detect. Uh, let's talk a little bit about common objects of senses. So the common objects, the difference between them and the special objects of senses, that the common objects of senses can be detected by multiple senses. Oh, great. So what are some examples of common objects of senses? Right. It can detect by at least two senses. And so this is a broad category. There's lots of different stuff that could fit into this one. He gives a couple of examples, but what's something you probably can use multiple senses to figure out? Yeah, food. So like what are some different senses I can use to figure out something's food? Yep. Yeah, use both of those. You could use like touch too. Points out like, well, yeah, and I guess we'll talk about this when we get to like the different types of senses too, but yeah, touch, smell, food, eyesight. So a lot of people think that the reason why humans have really good eyesight is that we learned to like it's because a lot of fruits as they start to molder and stuff, they'll change the colors as they ripen. So we can tell when a ripe banana is ripe because it's yellow. Same with like a lot of fruits and stuff. We can also tell when something's rotten. When a banana comes brown, it means it's time to eat this banana before it's gone. So they think a lot of folks think the reason why humans have such good eyesight is that since we don't have a great sense of smell, we need to use eyesight to figure out when something could potentially be going bad. Uh, what's some other? So like food is a really good example. We could talk about like one of the examples he gives is motion. And so we could think about this for like a predator. I can tell like a predator something's coming or like a bit danger if I can hear it. If I can hear like a stampede, I can probably feel it if it's like a lot of people or a lot of cows moving at the same time. I can feel like the earth shaking. I'm probably gonna be able to smell them if they're really stinky, or yeah, also be able to hear them. So there's like motion is one of the examples he gives. I can use motion and detect. Oh, sorry, I can use a lot of senses to detect motion is happening. Another one he gives is like magnitude. So I can use like my sense of touch, sight to tell me how big something is. What's another one he gives? But yeah, most of the other stuff that you and I would think of or like experience, we could describe as like a common object sense. I can use multiple senses to detect these things, but there's only a few things that are special objects of the senses, something that can detect only one of the sense. And so I didn't want you guys to have to read through all of the different topics. Like he goes through and describes like each of the senses in detail. And each of them, he says something that like, and we'll talk about like we can debate about this, but he says that touch is one of the primary senses. And if you read the section that he has about touch, he makes an interesting argument about why. Um, Another reason why he says that touch is the primary sense. And he says that humans have the best sense of touch, and that's what makes us like better than a lot of the other animals because we can distinguish between all the different types of soft and hot and cold, and that's why we're like smarter or something than all the other animals, which I don't necessarily agree with. You guys should read through that if you haven't yet. I think it's like section 8 or something like that in book 2. But he goes through and lists in detail like some of the different things that are different and unique about each of the senses. And what I would just want to wrap up with is that he does describe towards the end that is that each of the senses requires a medium to transmit the object to the sense. And so, for example, like we can usually think this is pretty easy. It's like, what do you mean when you say that we have a medium? What's a medium? Does anyone know what that means? It's a pathway, right? And so for sight, this is kind of easy. For sight, he just describes like two mediums that we can have for sight. What is something that sight has to pass through or be able to use? So I heard this may be tough when we have multiple people. Uh, Jordy, what did you say? The the eyes is the organ. That's like where the it does have to get to the eyes, but the eyes we could say is like the organ. That's where this power sight rests. But if I have an object and the organ that it has to get to, what does sight have to, or sorry, what does the the image of the object have to pass through in order to reach the eye? What's the medium in this example? Oh, did Zena leave? Okay. Yes, well, like I think it is related to light, and I'll have to read up on that section again. But yes, points out that like light is necessary in order for us to see things. And he makes a distinction that when it's dark, even though those objects haven't disappeared, I just can't see anymore, and I can't pick up that color anymore. And so light has, I think points out that light is necessary, and it has to be able to pass through things that are transparent. And he just gives two examples of things that are transparent that light can pass through, and he gives air and water for what things that light has to be able to pass through. So I think he would say that light is the medium, or air and water is the medium of sight. Does anyone want to take a guess? What would it be for sound? What does sound have to pass through? Think back to physics class, not like Aristotle's physics. Right, you need to be able to have some kind of vibration in order for sound to be able to be transmitted. And so he only talks about air and water in this example. But if you guys have ever seen, I don't know if you've oh dang, this probably isn't something that you would ever run into in Belize, but in the U.S. there are certain towns that have trains running through them. And an old story, or like what a lot of parents will tell their kids before they try to cross the train track is, you put your head down to the train track, and you put your ear right next to it, and you can feel the vibrations if a train is coming. And that's a you will. I'll have to see if I can send you guys this video, but it explains like the kind of physics behind it. But because vibrations will travel faster through a solid than they do through the air or through the water, sound will travel faster through a solid than it does through the air or water, which is kind of interesting because then we could also talk about like that's why sound doesn't pass through a vacuum, and why sight or color does. Color does not need, or sorry, light does not need a medium to go through. It'll transmit through air and water and through space, but sound cannot travel through space because it needs a solid object. He then goes and describes like the different mediums for smell and taste. So taste, he says, you need to have like a liquid. If your mouth is dry, you can't taste things, according to Aristotle. But in order to smell stuff, you need to have air. But he argues that for maybe living, like aquatic creatures, they might be able to smell through water. This is the case for sharks. Sharks have a really good sense of smell, but they smell stuff through the water. And then he describes touch, and he says that for touch, the medium has to be the body. It has like my hand has to touch something physically in contact in order for me to feel it. So that's kind of interesting. He gives like a different or medium for that one, but he argues that the body or the flesh is a medium for touch. Okay, so that kind of covers up all the things I think I want to talk so far about sensation. How am I doing on time? Okay. So the next thing that I think he kind of ties in with sensation is that he says wherever sensation exists, desire also has to exist. And so sensation, because I can sense things, it allows me to experience things that are good for me and things that are bad for me. So we talk about those paired contraries that exist in each of the senses. There are sights that are pleasant for me, and if I see something that's too bright, it causes pain. Or if I have a happy medium where like things are too cold or too hot. And so because I can sense things, that allows me to experience things that are pleasurable and painful. Animals can at least then use senses to seek out things that are good, such as food, and avoid things that are bad, such as pain. Now, what he states is that he doesn't really, I don't think in this part he's really so far given his defense for why he doesn't say that locomotion has to happen to all of the animals, or why it doesn't always happen with sensation. He says that the bare minimum is that whenever I can sense something, I can experience things that are good and experience things that are bad, and try to avoid things that are bad and move towards things that are good. I guess my only reason for why he wouldn't say that locomotion is present in all the animals is that perhaps if he studied, I don't think he gives an example, but perhaps we can think of clams and barnacles. Those are clearly animals and they're not plants. Like we can see that, like he probably would have had like these clams that could respond to touch. You know, clams, they open up their shells when they're trying to filter feed, and if you touch them or you touch barnacles, they'll close up their shells. So I don't know if like that's where he got this from, is that he was maybe looking at some things that we consider animals, like these clams, seafood, other stuff. You can see like how they could at least respond to touch, and that was maybe what he gives defense, that okay, maybe not necessarily all animals can move, but they can at least respond to touch, and they can respond to pain and pleasure. Did I talk about why touch is the primary sense? Okay, I didn't put it in a point here about why he states that touch is the primary sense, but I think it has something to do with this, is that at least at some level, all animals out there can respond to touch. So we can talk about like, and I think some folks, I guess when he's describing primary, he's not necessarily saying that it's the most important sense, because for different organisms, different senses will be more important. For humans, we can kind of make by without like a sense of touch, you could argue. Like, I could lose my hands, in a tragic accident, but I'm gonna still be able to run around. I could like make myself a prosthetic hand or something like that, and I'll get by. It's really difficult for human beings to exist in the wild with they lose their sight. And so we could think about this with other organisms. Perhaps for bats, sight's not super important, but hearing is way more important to them. They can use, echolocation to find their way in the dark. I could talk about what's another one? Worms. I think that was the one that I responded a lot of folks with, is that worms can't necessarily see things. They can't necessarily smell things, although I think that people aren't really sure if they can smell things or not. But and then jellyfish. Jellyfish are one of the simplest animals out there. They don't have brains. They don't have. Some folks I think have found like little like eye spots, so they can respond to and see things that are dark and light, but they can't take in the same like sight information that we do. But the base requirement, at least for all animals, that somehow they're still able to respond to touch. And so if I touch a jellyfish, like all it's gonna do is like it's just gonna start flapping faster, but it's not necessarily going to do anything else. So at least at some level, all animals, he argues, can respond to touch. It's not the most important sense to the different animals, but it's at least like the most basic sense that all animals have in common. Let me see, how am I doing on time? I have 15 minutes left. All right. I guess the last thing that I want to point up is that like this is like, I hope this kind of generates some stuff for us to think about, but a lot of us, like one good example that a lot of us brought up as well, what about Venus flytraps? Venus flytraps are an interesting carnivorous plant that if you've ever seen them, I think that's all well, yeah. They have these hairs on their leaves, and so if like an insect or something touches those hairs, the leaf will close shut, and they'll eat whatever that bug is. And so if we were describing those animals being just sensitive or being able to possess like a sense, Venus flytraps could count as something that is sensitive. I think, whereas like today, we could go into, I think this is like a simple definition. We could like go more in depth in this. I think there's more stuff that other scientists would add, but at least plants, they're able to produce their own food. They use sunlight, while as animals are heterotrophs, meaning that they consume or have to get their food from something else. I'm going to stop share now so you can see me, but I guess basically I want to point out is that we have like these two different approaches for explaining the difference between plants and animals that we can try and compare and contrast to see how effective they are. So the reason why I want to bring this up is that I think does anyone know like what is the simplest animal by the definition we have in the modern definition today? Like that animals are just consumers. Does anyone know what the simplest animal is out there. Plankton, plankton would work. I mean, there's like, I guess there's like different types of plankton. You have some that like float around freely, and they are consumers, but they're also Oh, let me see. I don't know if that's what I wanted to find. Hmm. At least when I was going through, let me see if I can find. Trying to find the. Maybe I can share my screen. Okay. Did anyone know that sponges are considered animals? This is the answer that I was like trying to find out. But at least when I was going through schools, that sponges are considered to be the simplest animals. They're not necessarily plants because the way that they get their food and stuff is they're filter feeders, and so they have like they kind of act like barnacles. They have like all these little tiny um, cells. Like they're kind of divided up. There's like two different types of cells. I think that's another thing that I should have added to that PowerPoint. But I think the simplest definition we have now for animals is that they had to have like, at least like two different types of tissues, and they consume stuff from the environment and they can't break. But I have to double check that because I think that we don't consider mushrooms to be animals either. So I'm not sure why sponges are considered animals and mushrooms aren't. But I guess what I want to just point out with this is that when we can start getting into like these definitions, we can see that there's like different animal or like there's like are going to be organisms that seem to like, well, which category does this one fit into? Which one is better? And I guess the short answer is like, I'm not really sure which one's the best one. I think what Aristotle's getting at is that we can think of like, I think in the beginning of this section, he talks about there's three different ways that physicists can go about looking at stuff. We can just describe like, what's the material that it's made out of, what's the stuff. We can look at like what's the end or the purpose that's supposed to do. And he said like this is like the dialecticians or something did. And then he says there's a third approach where we try and take the both together. And so if I think just trying to compare it to today, like how folks look at it, I would say like most scientists today tend to be more materialistic, looking at like what's the stuff that's made up. So they're going to try and define like all the different tissues, like the difference between plants and animals, like, how many cells they have, what kind of tissues do they have. Like, plants are able to, or they're can do photosynthesis, whereas like mushrooms, they still have to be able to break down those stuff. But as you get into those different, whereas like we can probably look at Aristotle's definition, most of us argue it's like more like that dialectician approach to us. That's like he's getting at like what's the different form or like the essence of like these different things. And so that's what we should just take into account. Like these are two very different approaches for looking at how plants and animals are different. I think it's still useful for us to think about because there are weird organisms out there. Like, is a sponge? Do I really think a sponge is an animal? I'm not really sure. I mean, we could talk about SpongeBob, and SpongeBob's different, but a lot of us, looking at a sponge, would not necessarily think that that is an animal. It doesn't seem to move. It doesn't seem to respond if I touch it, unless you're like looking at it with a microscope. Because you really like, if you guys ever look up videos of barnacles or jellyfish, like, yeah, they're pretty simple, but I can see that like, they close up or they do respond in some way when I touch them. I wouldn't be able to necessarily tell that with a sponge. Same with like Venus flytraps, though. You and I would mostly argue that like they are not animals. I think most of us argue like, they can they can do photosynthesis, but it is kind of funny that though that like them and other carnivorous plants, they do respond to touch when you mess with them. And so are barnacles and Venus flytraps the same? Are they different? How do you tell the difference between these two? And I think with either of those approaches, you're going to have like these weird organisms that kind of fit in that gray area. And so it's just fun to think about where is the where do you draw that line? And I think you have to like you do have to choose, I guess, one of those two approaches to rule out. All right, if I'm just going to rule by can it produce does it do photosynthesis? Then yes, a Venus flytrap is an animal. Oh, sorry, a Venus flytrap is a plant if it can do photosynthesis. Does it eat other things and does it respond to touch? If I go to the Aristotle's approach, then yes, a Venus flytrap in a way could be a animal. And I guess the last thing I wanted to leave you guys to think with though is if you go back, if you read through part 12, and maybe I'll just like share this again. I think something that's really important for us to take into consideration. Can I bring back up? Let me see. Let me share my screen. There we go. Okay. I think one thing that we should take into account is that when he says, like, it's the power receiving it to itself, the sense of form of something without the matter, he does make the distinction that if I, so in a way, like, I can affect, or like, I can see that, like, plants, like, we could say, like, they do seem to respond to changes in their environment. Is it true that they are able to receive those sensible forms without the matter themselves? So he makes a distinction, like, with rocks and water, like, I can see they respond in a way to if I throw stuff in them. He says I can affect these things. Are they able to take in that object or sense something's happening without taking in the matter themselves? And so I guess what's important, like, it probably makes more sense when we think about like an animal or a human, that like I can look out and see my friend or my mom walking from a distance, and I can see, taking the information, I can say, okay, that is my friend. I mean, I guess I get closer, I can tell like more and more information about it. I can take in that form without necessarily needing to take in the matter to know that it's them. Whereas with, he argues perhaps with plants, is that in order for them to take in the the information of receiving the object, they have to take the form and the matter in order to receive or to trigger that response. And so we'll spend a little bit more talk about that, but I have about 8 minutes left, I think, on this Zoom meeting before it's going to try and kick me out. So I will finish there. That's just what stuff I want to leave you guys to think with. But I think it's important that he says that, and we could also talk about this later on, try to apply this to like machines and stuff. Like, that's going to be something interesting that a lot of you guys will probably, in our lifetimes, people are going to start raising more questions like, are machines, there's like a scary video, well, kind of interesting movie that came out a couple of years ago called oh my gosh, what is the name of that movie? I'll have to look it up and send it out. But essentially it's like, I think it was called like Trappy or something like that. Is about this like robot, or yeah, we could think of all the iRobot movies, like these robots that are able to like take in a lot more information, seem to have like emotions and stuff. Are they able to sense things? Are they the same level as like humans are, as they can be able to like rational, like make decisions, respond to stuff in their environment? So I think that's just like an interesting question that we could think about for these, like, are plants actually animals? Like, how do we try and distinguish that difference as we got some that started to blur the lines? Okay, so I'll stop there. Does anybody have any questions from anything so far? And I guess one thing we can try to do, let me see if I can can you guys all see the chat? Does that pop up, you guys? I think one thing we can try to do so that people aren't like trying to talk over each other. Can I make it so? Yeah, if you have a question, just type in you have like a question or something into the chat, and then I can just call on that person and they can answer the questions. That way, we're not trying to like talk over each other. But yeah, does anyone have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far? Anything from any of the readings thus far, or any of the assignment stuff so far? Yes, that is a great question. So I did usually what I did for most of the assignments. This is a mistake of mine, but I was able to just go into the Google Classroom, make it so that each of you had your own copy of the assignment. For some reason, though, I messed up this time, and so that way you guys are all able to access the same Google Doc for your class. So what I'd like for you guys to do is just like each person, you just need to answer at least one of the questions. Like, I can still see in Google Docs like who edited what question. So I just want to make sure like by Thursday, at least each of you like respond to a question. You guys can treat this as like a class project. You guys can each work together to like answer the questions and stuff. But I just want to see that everyone at least answers one of the questions in your class's Google Doc. Good question, Zena. Yes, this is like the reading that was due today. I pushed it back to Thursday. Yeah. So I think if you are, it's like, I think I saw Shamir and Jory, you guys already added stuff, so you're good. As long as you answer like one of the questions in that Google Doc, that's all I'm looking for. If someone else wants to add to it, I just need to see like, how they added, or they need to at least make some kind of contribution to that Google Doc. Yes, that is the end of class. Through kind of an open discussion point. Feel free to chime in if you would like. Sure. What is Jason? What are you doing? Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. That's very true. Yeah. And you can think of optical illusions and stuff, or like, people who make like those murals that makes it look like, oh, let me see if I can find this mural that I want to share. People do like all kinds of like street art of like a canyon or something, so make it looks like, if you step art canyon. Let me see if I can find. Oh yeah, this is some fun ones. Let me see. Let me share my screen. Share screen. Let's do share. Let me see. So yeah, you can see like all kinds of. Let's do this one. Street art where people will make it, draw it so that it looks like they could fall into like this. Oh here. Oh, this is a fun one. Let's do this one. I don't know if this is just gonna pop up or be able to see it. Oh, that's lame. I was hoping this would be bigger. Okay, but you can kind of see like, they can make like these optical illusions where it looks like, they're standing on this cliff face or something like that, but they're really just standing on like a concrete floor, something like that. So that's another example. Like, yeah, glad you brought that up, Jason. Um, my internet's being a little slow. Okay, what other things? Other questions? What did you guys think of the Privileged Planet video? Mhm. Yeah, that was pretty wild. I just think it's interesting how, well, yeah, anyone else have any comments or something they wanted to share? Yeah? Yes. So for that one, that was during the solar eclipse. And so what happened was, and again, um, when the moon came in between the sun and the earth, what was happening is that they were then able to pick out two. I'll have to see. This is gonna be kind of hard to display with. Let me see if I can find. Oh, it'll take too long. Okay. So the way that what happened was is that when they were able, one of the neat things about the solar eclipse is that because the moon blocks up most of the sun, they were able to pick out like, the little pinpricks and stuff of light around the sun, and that like they were able to do all this like this imagery to figure out like, what were the different elements that were coming from the sun. They wouldn't be able to do that if the moon was too big or too small. One of the other things they picked out those they were able to pick out like pinpricks of light coming from other stars that are on the opposite side of the sun, and that wouldn't be possible if the light wasn't being bent around the sun. So yeah, so like the light track. So like if I'm going from here, I have my two little stars over here, and the Earth's like over here, kind of wherever this like mirror thing is my mom has. And so what's happening is that like my face, yeah, I guess I could say like my face is the sun. What's happening is that normally the light would just keep going and spread out like this. But what's happening is that the light's getting bent. Oh, Jason, someone's got it. But anyway, what's happening is that the light's getting bent around the sun, so it doesn't follow a straight path. It's showing like the force of gravity, how gravity can bend the different parts of light. And that was part of Einstein's theories, is showing that gravity has this ability to bend space around it in a way. And so that light has like different properties. And so yes, exactly. And so that's because they were able to see this with that eclipse. They were able to see like the path of that starlight. They wouldn't be able to see the stars from the other side of the sun if the eclipse wasn't in its place. And so that's how this eclipse helped them prove Einstein's theory. Because otherwise, like normally the sun's too bright, they wouldn't be able to pick up the light from those stars unless the sun was there. Great graphic. Thanks, Jason. No, you don't. For this homework, you just have to answer one of them. I would recommend you going through them, and I would still recommend you doing all the reading because I still think like that part of chapter 12 is really good to read and look over. But yeah, unfortunately, this I don't. I think it's just gonna get too crazy. I mean, if everyone's trying, I guess the other option we could do is you guys could copy it yourselves at this point and just make like your own. If you would rather do that, you can. Um, But yeah, I just need to see at least that everyone's like responded to one. I figure at this point, like everyone's probably already seen each other's, or like at least those who are active have probably already seen each other's answers and stuff. So I just want to make sure that at least each person takes responsibility for answering one of the questions, or at least like comments on one question. Yes. Okay. Looks like Zoom is not kicking me out yet, so this is good. Okay. I didn't know that. I thought it was going to kick me out. Maybe I. Oh, I was getting confused with this. I guess I can go ahead and stop this now. This video thing that I was making for that.